In a brutally violent surprise, Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023, killing over 1,000 and taking at least 150 hostages. And we know now at this time, at least 29 Americans were killed. The attack marked another dangerous escalation in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. And today, to help us better understand this developing and critical situation in the Middle East, is Dr. Gabe Scheinmann, the executive director of the Alexander Hamilton Society, an independent, nonpartisan membership organization dedicated to promoting constructive debate on basic principles and contemporary issues in foreign, economic, and national security policy. Gabe, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Let's dive right in. We've got a lot to unpack here, but we're really seeing what is now the next steps after a brutally violent attack. Israel is launching a response to the Hamas terrorist attack. There are complications with hostages in Gaza and likely a reluctance to occupy Gaza. What kind of strategy can we expect over the next days, weeks, months, and what are we seeing in Israel right now on the ground?
Thanks, Savannah. So I think the first thing, just take a slight step back because we should be humble in trying to predict the nature and future of war, is that on October 6th, i.e. the day before this attack, no Israeli anywhere was thinking about, should Israel have some sort of presence in some capacity in Gaza afterwards. So let's just recognize that this is not just a shocking or a higher level or more horrific example of long-standing Hamas attacks against Israel. This is of a different nature, and the Israelis see it that way. And so I think a lot of people have called for already, well, what is the long-term Israeli goals and long-term Israeli presence that might be seen in Gaza, and how could you possibly figure out what to do next without agreeing on that? And I think most Israelis are saying, the days where we had to think all the way through to the thought before we do anything are over, given what has happened, and we need to act first and foremost to protect ourselves. So let's just put a larger caveat on that. More broadly, I think you're going to see the Israelis shift from what has basically been a strategy of deterrence to one that is a strategy of denial. And what do I mean by that? I mean that for the longest time, both in Gaza as well as on its northern border in Lebanon with Hezbollah, the Israeli approach has essentially been to deter both of those entities by essentially saying, we're not going to prevent you from arming yourselves. We might in a variety of ways, but that's not the focus. If we see you planning or training or practicing things in Gaza, we are not necessarily going to intervene, but we are telling you out loud that if you attack us, we will do significant damage to you. And it is that threat of deterrence that is actually keeping things at bay. And what they've made very clear is that has failed. And instead, by announcing publicly that they are going to move into Gaza physically by air, land, and sea, which are the words that they have used, and that the goal of the operation is going to be to end Hamas's governance of the Gaza Strip and end Hamas's ability to wage war against Israel. They're going to move into a place where they're going to actively seek to eliminate their war-making capability. Now, what that actually could mean in practice can take on a lot of different dimensions, and obviously it's too soon to know, and the Israelis are understandably staying relatively mum about it. But for starters, it could mean moving ground forces into Gaza in order to create a buffer zone, let's say inside the Gaza Strip, and so that the ability of armed men, of terrorists, to be able to approach, break through, and invade the fence and wall that Israel constructed around the border is significantly lessened. The latest Israeli reports is that there were perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 Hamas men that participated in the actual land assault, something that was unheard of or unthinkable before that. So one is being able to control a significant presence there. The second is you may have seen Israeli calls for civilians in northern Gaza to basically move southward. And the Israelis have given them the time to be able to do that. The Israelis are sacrificing a significant amount of operational advantage by announcing that. They're functionally giving Hamas time to set up its booby traps, to mine its passageways, to move the hostages deeper and disparate places they were. I mean, there is cost to Israel doing this, but the reason they're doing this is they want to be able to minimize any sort of civilian damage or collateral that may happen as a consequence of an operation. and perhaps even isolate the northern part of Gaza from the southern part in order to better interdict some of the weapons flow and personnel movement that move forward. You are also probably going to see them take more aggressive action, even at sea, to try and end arms flows among those ways. So the overall, again, the specific nature, it's going to be hard to predict, but the idea is that they're no longer just going to be able to count on their threats to punish Hamas if they attack, and basically say, we're going to make it so that you don't have the capability to attack us like this ever again. So far, in their public pronouncements, the Israeli government have been mostly focusing these goals or these attentions on Gaza and Hamas, as has President Biden. But basically every day, and it seems to be escalating a little bit, you also see the possibility of a second front opening in the north. And we'll see where that goes. The Israelis are often pretty good about about staying mum on things that they want to do. But the same logic that they are now applying to Hamas in the south applies tenfold on the northern front as well. Hezbollah's arsenal of rockets and missiles is not only significantly larger than what Hamas has built, it is also significant. They have a significantly larger number of longer range missiles. They have a significantly larger number of heavier payload missiles. And they even have, and this is the most dangerous threat, they even have, by a number of estimates, several hundred precision guided missiles, which Hamas does not have. And so if the lesson that Israel is taking away from what has happened on its southern border, that Israel cannot deter and tolerate this presence, you have to imagine that they're thinking very much the same way on the north. There's an open question from a strategy standpoint about whether Israel can afford to fight two fronts at the same time, given the shock and what has happened, and given the mobilization of significant reserves, as well as given the clear, I think, political support from the United States for doing something in Gaza, but not necessarily elsewhere, or whether they would like to try and sequence these operations and deal with Hamas first and Hezbollah a little bit later down the road. Obviously, it's very difficult to know exactly what's going to happen over the next few days and weeks as a consequence of that.
Certainly. And you bring up a couple really important points. I think the mention of Hezbollah to the north, the obvious underpinnings of the role of Iran in both Hamas and Hezbollah, and then the role of the U.S. So I want to ask you a little bit more about the U.S. role. Obviously, as strong supporters of Israel, we've already seen the U.S. provide support, military necessities to Israel. What do you imagine is going to be the ongoing role of the U.S. in this conflict, particularly as it continues in the South, but if it expands in the North, what does that look like?
So, I hope everybody watched President Biden's remarks last Tuesday, almost a week ago now, where I think he actually spoke incredibly eloquently and really from the heart in terms of what has happened, and called a spade a spade. We've seen so many other institutions in our country and people seemingly fumbling over the basic humanitarian words to describe what happened, and that's not what the president did. So he really did a wonderful job, and I think it touched quite a lot of people in that way. But I would say is that the U.S. policy right now is what I would call a bear hug, which is that they're holding Israel very, very close. Right, we are horrified by what has happened. There is no justification for what has happened. Israel not only has a right, but as the president said, a duty to be able to defend itself and do what is necessary. The president's come out and said that we support Israel seeking to eliminate Hamas. Hamas is a U.S. designated terrorist organization, I would add. And so on all the things that have to do with Hamas directly, the United States, there are shipments of arms that have already landed in Israel in that way, and there are likely more to come. So on that side, holding it tight. Why do I say bear hug? Because it means that the United States does not want Israel to either preemptively expand the conflict to other fronts, whether that's in Hezbollah or Iran, and it is trying to deter Iran and Hezbollah from joining in the conflict. And you saw that in the president's public pronouncements, where he said a couple times directly into the camera to the Iranians, don't get involved. You also see this as the motivation as to why the president has ordered two carrier groups, aircraft carrier groups into the Eastern Mediterranean and one closer to the Persian Gulf, with the idea being is that the United States is now trying to deter Hezbollah Iran from joining in. This is a bit of a complicated situation for Israel because, as you just pointed out, the Israelis see the Iranian threat with something they call the octopus. And Iran is the head of the octopus, and Hezbollah and Hamas are two of its tentacles, and there are others. And they're in a little bit of this situation where, in many ways, the weakest of the tentacles, Hamas, the one that Iran feels the least obligated to, and the one in which Iran has the least, let's say, integrated operational connection to, even though there's a lot of reporting out there suggests Iran helped not only, we know Iran arms and aids Hamas, but also specifically supported this operation. So they were attacked by the weakest of the three, and yet they are concerned or being prevented from trying to go after the real source of the problem in many different ways. And this is a source of tension, I think, that is for the moment happening behind the scenes, or more in being what is unsaid. But it's a source of tension that is going to continue to emerge, I think, between the United States government and the Israeli government on this front.
Let's bring it back to the U.S. here for a moment, because this is a huge focus, obviously, for the U.S. government, for the American people. This is flooding our news cycles, social media, et cetera. But it's not the only issue that is happening here in Washington. We have seen a lot of dysfunction happening surrounding the U.S. House of Representatives. So does this impact the conflict happening right now? Does this impact U.S. resolve at all, or will we see the mission continue and the support for Israel continue?
So I'd say it's no in the immediate days, but the longer that this goes on, the more problematic it is, right? So look, this week, last week, the Senate is out of session, and that wasn't changing. And so the fact that there is no permanent speaker, and there hasn't been for, it depends what time this goes out, but for 2 weeks now, is relatively moot, given that that's not going to happen. The concern is that Israel will request a emergency aid package. Could be funding, could be specific sets of replenishments of arms, more specifically the interceptors. They're called Tamir interceptors for its Iron Dome missile defense system. Could be ammunition. Could be basically air-launched small diameter bombs. It could be a number of things that it feels like it needs, or more importantly, things that it thinks it may need in 2 or 3 months' time. Not that what it actually needs this week, but down the road in that way. That requires appropriations from Congress. That clearly is going to require a resolution not only to the speaker crisis, but even beyond that, an ability for first the Republican caucus in the House, and then obviously Republicans and Democrats together in the Senate and the House to be able to find common ground, to be able to move this forward in that way. So the concern is not last week, this week, or even next week. I think it will be some time before Israel really needs some of these things. The concern is that what this portends for the longer duration of this. Already, there's a debate, obviously, mostly inside the Republican Party, about American military aid to Ukraine. This is partially what contributed to the near government shutdown and the removal of the speaker, although not the direct cause. That remains unresolved. There are different strategies, both within Democrats, within Republicans, within a pro-Ukraine caucus, anti-Ukraine caucus, about whether the aid packages for Ukraine and Israel and maybe Taiwan or border security should be combined into one, because there does seem to be a large majority that pisses off different sides of both parties to support these things, but that is not a sure thing either, and complicated. And so I do worry that as the weeks might drag on, and whatever speaker gets elected, he may be subject to the same pitfalls that Speaker McCarthy was, that this just creates a hair trigger situation where you can never be sure of what the Congress will support over the longer run.
Certainly, and something that we will continue to watch. I mean, we've heard from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin just days ago that the United States will be supplying Israel with the capabilities and supplying Ukraine, but obviously we need to look to the House to see how that happens and how the appropriations and everything shakes out post-speaker. So we will be watching that closely. Sticking with the U.S., I want to understand and unpack, because I know you have a lot of work with college campuses, understanding the reaction on college campuses. We are seeing a mix of protests from different groups here across the United States in reaction to what is happening to Israel. And I want to hear a little bit about your experience and what you're seeing on the ground there.
So part of what we do, it's the foundation of what we do, is that we help run a network of student-led chapters on college campus across the country, mostly undergraduate, and they host content, they host programming, they host debates on American foreign policy, where through us, they bring to campus a scholar or a practitioner, someone who served in government that to speak or debate on a topic, or somebody who shares a view that America needs to be a strong and principled leader in the world, and debate often the opposing view on those campuses. It has not been a good week for higher education on that front. You have seen on many campuses large numbers of, I say in air quotes, supposedly pro-Palestinian groups, although in reality, the way in which they are speaking, they're not pro-Palestinian, they're actually pro-Hamas, but pro-Palestinian groups that have come out even before Israel has begun to respond, mind you. A lot of these statements actually from these student groups came out on Saturday, October 7th or Sunday, October 8th, right? So it's just reacting to the Hamas attack on Israel itself. But they've basically come out and blamed the victim. They've basically come out and said that Israel had it coming. They've basically come out and said that Hamas was justified in doing these things. The language that they have used is calling for the end of the 75-year occupation, i.e. the entirety of the state of Israel's existence, not in any specific border or specific time frame. And they've organized protests. And in some of these campuses, these protests have actually purposely marched by some of the Jewish institutions on campus, which is particularly concerning. University presidents, many of which have also issued statements, have fallen down on the job writ large. The statements have either been both sides-isms, and so you'll see language like, we mourn the loss of lives on both sides, or the loss of innocent lives on both sides, not distinguishing between attacker and victim. It is notable by the words they don't use. A lot of these statements will not use the word terror or terrorists in describing Hamas. They will use it as an example to also preemptively condemn or limit what Israel may do in response, which we still don't exactly know what they may do, and so forth, and a call for inclusivity and trying to lower tensions. It's one thing, in my view, for a number of students or student-led groups to be able to say some of these things. I mean, I think it's horrible and all these things, but it's, I think, even worse for the leaders of these institutions to do these things. No one is expecting or demanding that leaders of higher ed take positions on all issues out there. But when you see leaders of higher education rushing to take positions based on various U.S. Supreme Court decisions or various state laws or various other things around the world, but are remarkably silent or even worse, put out statements of word salads that don't mean anything to anybody, you sort of wonder why they're approaching this differently. And so we've already heard from quite a number of students who are, some of which are concerned for their safety, based on the fact that their own university has not sought to very clearly determine what is acceptable, what is actually free speech, and what are calls to violence, which is not free speech, or supporting them at a time of need. We have students that are concerned that some of the events that they're going to put on will get threatened or silenced. The threats are obviously easier to distinguish, and I think the university will take those seriously. It's the efforts to silence that people don't necessarily realize. So it's examples where administrators or professors might say to students, well, maybe you can choose a different topic to discuss because this is controversial, right? If you want to do something on what's happened, let's say, pro-Israel student groups or so forth. Maybe you could phrase this a little differently so that it doesn't fire people up. Maybe you could select a different speaker than the one that you initially wanted because they're more acceptable to the group, right? Or maybe you should, which has happened to our groups before on other topics, maybe at the beginning of the event, you should issue this specific statement, i.e. words given to them by administrator, about how they condemn violence against civilians and pray for peace, as if the baked-in assumption in there, obviously, that these groups somehow don't believe in those things. Those are a little bit the more nefarious or sort of less well-understood ways in which a lot of students are worried about that some of their work might get silenced. So I'm afraid that we're actually in for some more difficult days. I urge, there are some universities that have done the right thing. If you look at the University of Florida under the new former senator, but new president of the University of Florida, Ben Sasse, his statement was excellent. And even statements, for example, by the president of Tufts University or Northeastern University, which certainly in their statements talk about the need for dialogue and debate and that people have different views on things, but regardless, still have an unequivocal condemnation of this massacre. This is not that difficult to do these things.
Thank you. Really helpful to understand, and certainly something that social media plays a role in. We've seen these protests from college campuses take to social media, and we've also seen the recent conflict really utilize social media to share very graphic scenes, information warfare, etc. And we won't show them here, but it's something that really you can't quite escape if you are online and social media. So how have communication strategies and information, disinformation, misinformation, how has that played a role in this conflict? And what has the U.S. response been so far to this, if any?
I mean, the way you phrase it, that's a difficult question, frankly, for every family, every parent. In terms of these are horrible images, and it's a question of whether one thinks that these should be shown or not shown. I generally think that when it comes to our mainstream media or television shows, showing these is actually important. This wasn't just an attack. It wasn't just a massacre. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, but the Israelis have found documents that instruct Hamas fighters about first how to torture the people that they find, and then the ways in which they should kill them. And you've seen images of burned bodies whose hands were bound in the first place. You have now, because there are 200 or so hostages, you have plenty of evidence that Hamas fighters, before taking the hostages, filmed their abductions or their torture or their killings, and had the hostages call their families to explain what was going on. There really aren't words for this. This is not something that we have seen in a very, very long time. So I do think it actually is important, as long, obviously, as the information, the images can be trusted and verified, that this is actually shown to the world and shown in the United States in that way. The other thing that I think is a bigger role for messaging here in the United States is to explain who is ultimately responsible. There will undoubtedly be difficult scenes that come out of Gaza or Lebanon or wherever this conflict might go. There will. There's no way to sugarcoat this in different ways. But the messaging needs to be that is the responsibility of Hamas. That is the responsibility of the terrorist groups that first go out and attack civilians and then use civilians as human shields in order to, because they know that their adversary, Israel, will not attack them if they use them as human shields. So, right. So it's almost if you think about it, it's almost Hamas actually knows that the intent of Israel is not to attack civilians because of the use of this tactic. When Israel has called for the evacuation of civilians in the northern Gaza Strip, what is Hamas's reaction? Trying to keep them to stay. When Israel calls for the evacuation of these civilians from the northern Gaza Strip, it already gets accused of, well, that actually is the war crime because it will create humanitarian disaster. The idea of the flight, right? But if you say, well, would you rather them not call for this doing things? Oh, no, we can't do that. And so I do think it is important for our own leaders, whether that be the president, members of Congress, or leaders in the community, to be able to clearly express this and not conflate or confuse cause and consequence as to what has happened.
Certainly. We'll really appreciate you shedding some light on such a difficult subject matter. We will be following this closely to see both the reactions here in the United States and progress to support Israel, as well as the developments in Israel and Gaza. And hopefully we'll be able to get some more insights and analysis from you, Gabe. I want to share with our audience members, if you are interested in learning more about the resources of the Policy Circle, you can visit thepolicycircle.org. We will share the link description below in our YouTube description. And we will also share the link to the Alexander Hamilton Society, which is alexanderhamiltonsociety.org, to see more of Gabe's work here and what they're doing in the U.S. Gabe, thank you again for your time, and we look forward to seeing more of your analysis in the future.
Thank you, Savannah, for your work and the entire work of the forum.